خير إن شاء الله دلوقتي هاشغّل لكم الكورس، هو كورس جامد جدًا، يا رب تستفادوا بيه، إن شاء الله تستفادوا، يالّا بينا.
Hello and welcome to the first chapter of the photogrammetry course. We will start off with the best practices of photogrammetry that will help you to obtain the highest quality sources. We'll explore how the capturing device affects the final quality of the scan, what are the optimal camera settings and shooting patterns for every situation, and how to pre-process the raw photos in the freely available software Darktable with and without color checker, and what equipment may come in handy and what weather you should be looking for. So in other words, if you weren't familiar with the photographic part of the workflow as a 3D artist, we got you covered. One of the most common questions about photo scanning is what camera is the best? Can I use my smartphone or should I get a DSLR? In short, all capturing devices have three main properties that influence the photo scanned quality. And that is resolution, spatial fidelity, and access to the raw sensor data. It all boils down to these three properties, so in this tutorial we'll have a look at them. Let's start off with resolution. The common sense tells us that the more pixels have the source photos, the more points there will be after the alignment process. That's practically the first thing that comes to mind, and it's not too far away from the truth. Obviously, the 6 megapixels photos produce way more dense point cloud than the 0.6 megapixels sources. And then, if all other properties are equal, the higher resolution sources produce better meshes after reconstruction, and in turn, it results in crispier textures. And it all sounds good, but only if all other properties except resolution are exactly the same. Then the resolution becomes the only factor influencing the quality of photo scans, and we should obviously aim at getting the device with maximum resolution available, but there is a but. There is one more thing that influences the quality of photo scan data, and it is spatial fidelity, or effective resolution. The filmmaker and pixel pusher Steve Yedlin tells us in his blog that this one number, which is resolution, we believe somehow corresponds to the audience perceptual experience of sharpness and clarity. But the reality is that there are other attributes in the camera and throughout the image chain that all play a role. Sensor noise, film grain, halation, edge contrast, you name it. In other words, the quality of pixels. Well, if resolution is quantity, then spatial fidelity is quality. The obvious example of pixels that don't have enough quality is the noise caused by high ISO, for example. The input that has a high entropy, or the high noise-to-signal ratio, produce noisy meshes, no surprise about that. And from this perspective, resolution can be very deceptive. Here are two images for comparison. The left one has lower resolution and higher spatial fidelity, and the right one has higher resolution and lower spatial fidelity. If we zoom in into the right image, with the lower spatial fidelity, we will notice that the pixels are pretty much mangled by chromatic aberration and the noise. And I guess some camera shake on top of it. Exaggerated the effects to demonstrate the concept, but you get the point. And for the sake of comparison, let's zoom in into the lower resolution image on the left, which has a higher overall clarity, and we may say quality of pixels. It's so much better. So the main point to drive home is that the quantity isn't enough to describe the overall effective resolution. The spatial fidelity should absolutely be taken into account when talking about capturing devices. So what are the things in capturing devices that affect spatial fidelity? The sensor and the optics. Mainly the optics that affect distortion, corner sharpness, vignetting, chromatic aberration, and other artifacts that can influence and will influence the quality of pixels. As for the sensor size, the larger sensors, like the full-frame camera sensors, have larger photoreceptors, and it means the higher sensitivity to the light. It's physics. With smaller, less sensitive sensors, sometimes it's necessary to boost the sensitivity artificially via boosting the ISO value. and it degrades the signal by introducing lots and lots of noise. Then on top of it, the overall quality of optics comes into play. Some zoom lenses, especially the kit lenses, can produce a lot of chromatic aberration and other artifacts that degrade the overall quality of pixels. Here you can see that the image is fairly blurry, and that's already a bad thing, and the chromatic aberration takes as much as, 20 pixels. It's pretty crazy, and it definitely translates into lower quality output, lower quality meshes. And if it isn't bad enough, it translates to the quality of texturing as well. We can say that this looks pretty bad when we can actually register the chromatic aberration in the textures. The same object captured on a device with a sharper optics will look much better in any software, be it Meshroom or Metashape or Reality Capture. So the sensor and the optics quality are the things to watch for when choosing the capturing device, and historically it's been easier to find a DSLR with a decent lens than, say, to obtain the same level of sharpness on mobile. And it doesn't have to be expensive. The prime lenses can be very cheap and produce a great quality rendering, and the mid-range DSLR cameras can be bought for reasonable money actually. So to sum it up, it's definitely possible to take a decent quality photoscans using a phone camera, especially if there is enough light and if you're using a tripod. But in our opinion, even an inexpensive DSLR, especially with a decent lens, will most likely beat it in terms of the spatial quality. Here you can see the photo taken on a very affordable camera. And while we can tell that this is far from being perfect, it's still a little bit clearer and sharper than what my smartphone provided me with. It's just a matter of optics and the sensor size. And the third feature, which is super important in choosing the capturing devices, is the ability to access the raw data from the sensor. Without having the direct access to this type of data, we are doomed to use the JPEGs processed in a random way in camera. And in turn, this leads to unnecessary suffering. First of all, we'll have to deal with compression, which is a no-go in photo scanning. Any kind of compression, like the JPEG compression, is a degradation of the signal, and it definitely affects the quality of photoscan on all stages, during matching of the points, during reconstruction, and during texturing. And on top of that, the random in-camera processing usually mangles the contrast levels by applying some kind of an S-curve. And not only the contrast, but the chromaticity is pretty much mangled as well, like this should be red, so on and so forth. On the other hand, if the camera device can save the images in the RAW format, which can be processed in the application like Lightroom or Darktable in our case, we'll get the colors which are more or less correct, in the sense that they are close to the colors in the original scene. And in addition to that, we can use the developing capabilities of Darktable or any other such software for manipulating exposure and white balance in post. And that is a good news for photogrammetry. So having the access to the sensor data, which is usually provided in the form of the RAW files, is a must-have. Actually, we will talk about color management later in the course as well. So to sum it up, we should really care about three main things, which are resolution, spatial fidelity, and the access to the raw sensor data. These are the three things to watch for in choosing the capturing device, be it a DSLR, a smartphone camera, a camera that is mounted on a drone, whatever it is. In my opinion, the most cost-effective option is to get a prosumer-grade DSLR or the mid-range DSLR. It can be pretty affordable, especially if bought used, and especially if you don't need its video capabilities. That being said, a decent quality photoscans can be taken on a mid-range phone camera as well. It requires carefully choosing the shooting conditions and slightly more work in post-processing, but it's definitely a possibility as well. Actually, our first example from the practical side of the course will feature the asset captured on mobile. Thank you for watching, and in the next video we'll talk about tips and tricks of photo acquisition for scanning. In this video, we'll talk about acquisition of the photos for photogrammetry. Kudos to Jenny for his visit to the zone to help us out with the theoretical part of the course. So first of all, is everything scannable? Not quite. There are objects that are simply not suitable for photo scanning, like transparent, glossy, dynamic surfaces, or impractical, like complex objects. Let's start with the objects that are close to impossible to photoscan, like the objects that are made of glass. The problem with such surfaces is that there are no common points in different camera angles of this object, and that really complicates the process of finding the common points across all the photos. And either the object becomes invisible or explodes. Well, some photoscanning software is clever enough to interpret the changing reflections on the object as noise, and thus you still can get a pretty usable object. But it's much safer if the object is covered with some diffuse dust in the first place. Well, maybe you can help the process a little bit by spraying some diffuse material over it when it's possible. But generally, the highly glossy and reflective objects aren't really suited for photoscanning. It's because the reflection shifts its position across the camera angles, even across the camera angles that are relatively close to one another, and chances are that the result after reconstruction will be deeply disheartening, to say the least. Once again, the more diffuse is the surface of the object for photoscanning, the better. So from that perspective, I would always prefer the car, which is actually covered with the bird excrements. It makes it so easier to scan. It is amazing, honestly. Then the dynamic objects like the water are also no-no. Who would want to scan water? But anyway, anything that changes in between the frames, in between the photos rather. Even the changes in lighting in between the shots can provoke the problems with geometry. It will look pretty much very bad independent of the software, so it's much safer when the object is entirely static. If it's not supposed to be a 4D scan capture at 60 frames per second like in this Pixel Light demo, but that's the whole different story. Aggregates and porous volumes like trees, grass, bushes, you name it, are also not suitable for photoscanning. Not only it requires an enormous resolution and spatial fidelity to properly capture the strands of grass, it just makes very little sense from the perspective of how 3D assets are used and created in general. And it looks like a blob usually. Well, to be fair, I have seen some very impressive demos like this point cloud tree demo by Gerbot on Sketchfab, and I can imagine some intriguing use cases, and definitely I don't want to discourage you from experimenting. But anyway, usually scanning such objects make very little practical sense. Talking about practicality, there are types of objects, like the complex object with lots of thin parts, that technically can be scanned, but it would require an enormous effort to scan it properly. This bridge is a good example, I guess. It's a complex structure with lots of repeating parts, and it looks a little bit, how should I put it, non-solid. And non-solid, complex objects that occupy their bounding box in this porous kind of way are tedious to scan, let's put it straight. There are photoscanning artists that break this rule with no regrets, like Romain Ruffey. So with lots of practice and effort, that should be doable. And to prove it, we have captured our own motorcycle for the course. It's not as detailed, but as a proof of concept, I guess. But if you have a choice, there are easier objects to scan. Alright, the minimalistic and boring modern architecture and other featureless objects make no sense to scan, so we will put them in this category as well. It is simply much easier to do it traditionally in 3D. So we have taken a look at the objects that are either not suitable for photogrammetry or simply impractical. And to conclude this video, let's name the perfect candidates for photogrammetry. First of all, it should be a solid object that at the same time is both opaque and rough, like this roadblock. Then it would be cool if it was something unique that can't be recreated in 3D just as easily. It also won't hurt to keep the object static and make sure it has lots of texture and detail, like this derelict building that we will be reconstructing throughout the course. Or this dirt surface, for example. That being said, if it doesn't have aggregate and porous things covering it entirely. So old abandoned buildings, weathered barrels, crates, bricks, ground materials, everything that we love so much in this abandoned post-apocalyptic setting, everything fits greatly the paradigm of photogrammetry. Thanks to Eugenie and Nick for providing the photoscanned examples. My name is Gleb, and I will see you in the next video, how to photoscan different types of objects. In this video, we'll talk about how to scan objects, buildings, and interiors, and what are the scanning patterns. The different environments and situations lead to different challenges, and so let's see how to tackle small assets, facades and walls, corridors, interiors, surfaces or materials, and larger buildings. Probably the most typical use case of creating photogrammetry asset is this type of a small asset that you can walk around and shoot from different directions, and the most simple pattern is this circle around the object. Indeed, it's the simplest pattern that still allows to capture the object from all sides. It is important to frame the object in such way to maximize its surface versus the backdrop. For example, the camera can be rotated vertically if needed. Okay, so this is the simplest possible circular pattern that still allows to capture small objects. It can be extended like this. Now it resembles a hemisphere or an amphitheater built around this thing. And if you want to have even better coverage, it turns into a sphere. If you can put the object on something so you can shoot from below. The point is to maximize the number of possible camera angles to avoid the gaps and blank spots in the resulting reconstruction. If you're going to be scanning in studio, you would want to put the object on a turntable and put some light sources around the object so it's lit uniformly. Aside from that, that's the same story of trying to capture the object from all possible sides. There are cool little tricks like flipping the object on its side during photo session that allows to achieve the full 360 degrees coverage. And we will definitely explore this technique in detail in the practical side of the course. But basically, by rotating the object, we can trick the software into thinking that we changed the camera pattern. So by implementing this hack, in theory and in practice, we can achieve the full coverage. As for the facades and walls, we don't simply rotate around a single point in space, like our pivot point, but instead we move along the wall while keeping the same distance to this object and keeping the camera pointed straight into the wall. It is important to change the position of the camera in between the shots because that gives the photoscanning software the depth cues, and these cues are then used for reconstructing geometry basically. It is also fairly important to keep the same distance to the object in between the shots because that's the optimal use of resolution. Another crucial thing to maintain in between the shots is overlap. Let's repeat it together. The photos should overlap, and the overlap can be as large as 90%. If the facade geometry is more or less complicated, it can be useful to tilt the camera ever so slightly when walking along the wall. Like for example, if we pointed the camera straight into the wall and moved along the wall like this, we would have missed the left and the right sides of the column. The workaround this issue is simply maintaining the sharper angle, like this, and then change the camera angle like this to capture the surfaces that point to the right. And hopefully that will allow to nail down the full range of surface intricacies that this wall might have. Another thing that is absolutely crucial to get it right is the depth of field. It is important to keep objects in focus. And the closer is the focal point to the camera, the more shallow will be the depth of field. And conversely, the further away from the camera is your focal point, the larger depth of field you will have. So for example, if you would like to extend the focus to the entire building and not only this corner, you simply make a few steps away from the building and change the focal point, and voila, everything should be in sharpness now. That's definitely not super intuitive for non-photographers like me, but this is a nice little tip to remember. Here's a practical example of the relationship between distance to the object and depth of field. If you're standing too close to the column, you cannot put both the column and the wall behind it in focus. But as soon as you back off a little bit and change the focal point, it will be much easier to fit everything within the depth of field. And thus, everything will be in focus, and everyone will be happy, and the reconstruction will go well. I don't think that we should go into the weeds right now, but there is such thing as hyperfocal distance. In brief, that's the way to get infinite depth of field from a certain point all the way to the horizon, so you don't have to care about focus at all beyond this certain distance. That's a bit off topic though for our course, so I encourage you to read about it. Let's get back to the scanning patterns. The narrow spaces like corridors can be captured like this, with the wider lens, probably even fisheye lens applied. Let me simulate this in Blender really quickly. So here we have the focal length of 12 setup, and the space is very narrow indeed. That's the Bernardine cloister in Brest. So technically, with a lens as wide as this one, we can take a few steps forward, snap a photo, take a few steps forward, snap a photo again, and so on and so forth. And it will be enough coverage and enough material for a good reconstruction. As far as capturing interiors goes, we again don't simply rotate around our pivot point. It's the opposite of stitching panoramas. We should move like this alongside the walls while cutting the corners ever so slightly to maintain a decent overlap. It really looks like an ellipse, something like that. After some practice, it becomes the second nature, even if it don't make sense right away. It will definitely make sense on location. On capturing the surfaces, for example for material work, we can implement all kinds of patterns, but it's important to make sure that we still work in sequence, that the next photo overlaps with the previous one. It makes it both easier to follow the pattern mentally and not accidentally break it up during the photo session, and it's easier for the software to calculate it. We can either do a snake-like pattern, or maybe a spiral that can go inward, for example, so we don't accidentally film the parts of the soil that we have mangled already by stepping on them. And on capturing the surfaces, like for example for PBR textures, that usually require slightly more careful approach to overlap and resolution. The same pattern can be used for filming all kind of stuff actually, like for example we used it to capture this roof by using a drone. Once again, to achieve an even distribution of cameras, it is important to keep this sequence in mind and trying not to break it. Once we started talking about the drone photogrammetry, for the bigger objects we can use this kind of an onion rings pattern. It brings us back to capturing the smaller objects actually. This is nothing more than a few circles around. If we are fancy, we can try building a hemisphere from the camera angles as well. So these are the most common photogrammetry scenarios that we may have to deal with. Obviously, each new environment, location or asset or anything requires its own approaches, but these are the few things from which we can borrow the scanning patterns and we can mix and match them. Thank you for staying with us. My name is Gleb. You're watching Creating Photoscan 3D Environment Assets course. The next video will be about pre-planning the photogrammetry session. An important part of the photogrammetry process is pre-planning. The entire process starts with scouting the location that you would like to capture. Chances are you already know some intriguing location that you would like to visit with a camera, but first I would recommend to capture a so-called draft scan. The photos can be taken really quickly on smartphone. The whole purpose of this stage of the workflow is to check the potential angles and split the model into modules and just generally pre-plan the scanning session. Here we can tell that the wall ended up being pretty dense in terms of points, while the upper portion of the building suffers from not enough information, and that's something to keep in mind in the final photo session. It is especially evident with the mesh reconstructed that the balcony turned into kind of a blob, we should probably take it into consideration and do something about it. And then it's useful to split the entire object into modules or parts. So for example, on the first visit we will be scanning the wall, and then this part, and then that part. It's useful to have this mental model in place. Regarding pre-planning the weather, we should aim at getting the cloudy weather ideally. The sunny weather obviously produces hard shadows, and they are tediously hard to erase in post. The perfect type of weather for photogrammetry is overcast, cloudy weather without rain. Even if it may seem that the overcast weather produces this kind of featureless look on the object, it's not the case. With just enough spatial resolution in your capturing device, there is always a lot of detail, more than enough for unbelievable reconstruction. Once again, even though there are applications that are able to remove cast shadows in a semi-automatic way, it's still pretty much a showstopper, especially with some dappled light type of lighting scenario. On top of that, as we have already mentioned, the shadows tend to move, and that is definitely a red flag. It often leads to blobby and wavy geometry. Okay, I think it's still important to mention the delighting software like Edgesoft Delighter in the context of removing the lighting information from the textures. For now, let's say that the textures with the overcast lighting baked in are still much easier to delight than the textures with the sharp shadows. We'll pay attention to delighting throughout the course and do it together in Edgesoft Delighter. So before moving on location, it's worth checking the weather report. Yet another potential consideration is the time of day. Chances are that even if the weather is sunny, there still is a probability of the shadow being in the right place throughout the day. That is, if we have visited that location before and kind of understand where the sun will be at that moment. To be fair, that's a bit harder to predict than simply checking the weather forecast, but not impossible. And the sunny days provide a good opportunity to scan interiors. That's also something to think about. And I think there's no need to mention that there is no need to scan objects at night and late in the evening. On top of the sharp, multicolored light sources everywhere, it's simply not enough ambient light to get to the correct exposure. I find it fascinating that sometimes it's a matter of choosing the right time of the year. If you happen to stay in one location for long enough, like one city or something, you will probably wait long enough to get an opportunity to experience the same location in various seasons. So maybe you cannot scan it in winter due to the snow, and it's overgrown in summer, but then comes fall, let's say September 12th, and you discover out of a sudden that it's available for photogrammetry. Pretty much the challenges like the greenery blocking the main object fall under the category of accessibility. It may be the trees, or it may be related to the activities of humans in this area, especially on working days, or maybe on weekends specifically. It depends. There may be cars blocking the view of the object, or anything else of that sort. There could be a reconstruction of this part of the city started unexpectedly on that day when you were about to take a photo scan. So that's also something to include in your pre-planning if possible. So thanks for watching. That was Gleb Alexandrov for the photogrammetry course. In this video we have discussed the necessity of doing some pre-planning, scouting, checking the weather, choosing the right time of day if it depends on the position of the sun, well, choosing the right time of the year, and lastly checking the accessibility of location and maybe including it in your pre-planning. And of course it never hurts to visit the location in advance, spend some time there to create a draft photo scan. All these preparation steps will pay off during the final photo session. Hello my friends, in this episode from photogrammetry course we'll have a look at the camera settings, which are optimal for capturing photo scans. We'll explore such basic things as ISO, shutter speed and f-stop, in the context of photogrammetry, but actually we will start off with talking about RAWs. As we have mentioned already, such important decisions as color management shouldn't be left to camera to decide. The random in-camera color presets usually just mangle the contrast levels and the colors in general. And when it's coupled with compression of a JPEG format, for example, it's a disaster. By shooting in RAW, we get the access to the sensor data and we can arrange the colors in a physically plausible way, which is very close to the reference. More about that in the color management video. So that's the first thing, switch the RAW on. Okay, let's skip setting the mode to manual for a minute and talk about setting the white balance instead. An awesome benefit in shooting in RAW is that we don't need to calibrate white balance on set. We can do it in post, on developing the RAW sources. But you would need some kind of a reference, a gray card for example. Otherwise the process becomes a little bit eyeball-y. In other words, we don't have to care about setting the white balance in camera that much. It all can be sorted out later. The next thing that we should take care of right away is setting the mode to manual. Now, every camera has the auto mode, but it's no good to let the camera decide what the exposure should look like. It will lead to inconsistent, flickering output. And not only brightness will flicker, but also the depth of field due to the changes in f-stop. It is much safer to set the mode to manual. That will fix the ISO, f-stop and shutter speed settings. Alright, so we have switched the camera mode to manual. Now what should we do with the settings that contribute to exposure? How to get to the correct exposure? Every camera has the exposure value meter, and the most straightforward thing that we can do is to keep that meter around 0. Well, the EV values of -1 to +1 are acceptable, but if it's around 0, it means that you're just doing it right most likely, and hopefully there will be no overexposed or underexposed parts. What are the dangers of overexposure and underexposure? When the exposure value is set to the right, we run into the risk of clipping the higher end light values, like on the white bricks here. While this is not the end of the world, and we can still try to bring back those highlights in special software like Darktable, it's still pretty bad. And obviously, if we underexpose the photo, or expose it to the left, we will most likely discover a lot of noise in the darks after bringing it up in post. Or we will lose the darker portions altogether. So watching the EV meter is the good starting point. It's not always possible to keep it consistently around the 0 value though through the entire photo session. Sometimes the lighting conditions in one part of the environment may differ drastically from the other part of the environment. The wall that is further away from the main source of light will naturally be way darker than the area that is close to it. So after all, as an exception to this rule of having the exposure value around 0 at all times, you may need to adapt to the changing lighting conditions in the scene. Alternatively, you probably have such thing as exposure bracketing in your camera and you can turn it on. Exposure bracketing means that the camera snaps a bunch of exposures on releasing the shutter. For example, -2, 0 and +2. And then these multiple exposures are automatically stitched into a high dynamic range file, for example 32-bit EXR in post. We won't go into such details just yet, but photogrammetry software accept high dynamic range files as inputs. That could be a potent solution to the dynamic range problem, but for now let's keep it simple. Next, we have to take a closer look at the ISO, f-stop and shutter speed values. These three things are probably the most important to nail, and you will be tweaking them most often as well. By boosting the ISO, we can amplify the sensitivity of the sensor at the cost of extra noise and degradation of signal. So the perfect value for ISO is the lowest value available. Typically, it's the ISO of 100. But it's also the darkest value as well. What could we do to compensate the light levels? Simply put, we can use the slower shutter speed. For example, by slowing down the shutter speed to 1/10 of a second, we regain the EV values necessary to get the correct exposure. So yay, we can just use the slower shutter speed and there are no drawbacks. Not really. A really slow shutter speed makes a handheld shooting produce lots of motion blur due to the hand shake, and neither the optical or in-body image stabilization could help in such case. What could help though is using a tripod. So if you have some time to move the tripod in between the shots, it definitely sounds like the best solution. Okay, the next super important camera setting is the f-stop value, or aperture. The problem with opening up the aperture to allow more light in is that the depth of field becomes shallow, and once you start closing the aperture by increasing the f-stop value, everything gets in focus, but everything gets darker as well. And we also need to compensate it somehow. You guessed it, by slowing down the shutter speed again. Alright, shutter speed saves the day again. So you're telling us that we should put the f-stop value as high as we can? We need to put everything in focus, right? Well, there is a caveat as usual. Let's compare two f-stop values, 6 and 20. You can tell that with the f-stop value of 6, some parts of the wall still fall out of focus. So let's crank up the f-stop all the way to 20 and compare the results. Now it seems that pretty much everything is in focus, and that's a good thing. The bad thing though is that the phenomenon known as diffraction comes into play. In other words, a photograph grows progressively less sharp as you go from f8 to f11, from f11 to say 18, and at some point it becomes really bad and blurry. At the f-stop of 6 it isn't prominent at all, but see what happens at the value of 20, everything got a little bit blurry. That's diffraction. And in many lenses it's kind of unavoidable once you start really closing the aperture. So to find a sweet spot in setting the f-stop value, feel free to experiment with the f-stops in between, let's say, 8 and 11. Now let's summarize this section by naming the optimal values of ISO, f-stop and shutter speed again. When the tripod is available and you're willing to use it, then feel free to set the ISO value at its lowest. The aperture, or f-stop, should be somewhere in between 8 and 11, and then set the shutter speed to such value to get to the correct exposure. These settings are a good starting point. But yet there are different environments with different lighting conditions. Let's have a look at how the camera settings would change depending on the environment. Let's say we have to photoscan a dim lit place like a warehouse. The camera settings that we have just discussed are very universal, and they are a good fit for dim lit places as well. First of all, we don't have enough light to shoot handheld, so we assume that we'll be using tripod. So the first thing we do is drop ISO all the way to 100, set the f-stop to 11 to make sure everything is in focus, and then slow down the shutter speed to 1/15th of a second to get to the exposure value of 0. You'll need a tripod to keep the camera steady at such shutter speed, and you'll probably need to set a timer in the camera settings in order to not shake the camera additionally on releasing the shutter. Or alternatively, a remote would come in handy in order to not press any buttons at all. Many modern cameras can connect to smartphone, so that can serve as a remote. The other type of photoscanning scenario is when there's enough light to shoot handheld, for example outdoors. By saying enough, usually it's not nearly enough to drop the ISO all the way to the lowest number, so a compromise has to be taken. For example, ISO 200, f-stop 5.6 or something like that. And then the crucial thing, when shooting handheld, the shutter should be set as fast as possible. Let's say faster than 1/50th of a second. Otherwise it will be shaky no matter the optical image stabilization or in-body image stabilization. The important thing